Sometimes being a big fan of something can create a gap between the fan and the thing itself. We've all seen some extremely impressive professional animation from highly skilled artists, and if you consume all of this work but don't happen to have a background in visual arts yourself, that work can seem almost like magic. And it is, but only sort of. In reality, it's the result of years of training and years of production work as well. But even at a base level, even with only a rudimentary understanding of how animation works, you can create animated work yourself. And once you've gotten a taste for it, I think it can become kind of addictive. And thankfully, it's also one of the most wholesome addictions that I can think of. And to get started with animation, all you need to do is sign up for my course on Skillshare. Just use the code FlimFam52 and get, 2% off a 3-day trial. I'm not doing that. Hopefully I never do that kind of thing. Please send help if I start plugging that kind of stuff, all right? So what I want to do here today is explain to you in hopefully the least corny way possible that you actually can just start animating literally today. It's within reach. And I'm going to try to elaborate on this idea by first up talking about sort of my own experiences with getting into animation and getting back into visual arts as a whole. And then I'll try to talk about sort of how I've tried to move past some of the really common anxieties and insecurities that come up whenever I sit down to try to create basically anything. And then to close out, I will just give you like a quick overview of some of the tools you can use to get animating today. And I'll maybe even try to go over some really, really basic concepts of animation that I think you'll find really helpful, especially if you're starting out. And that's the big disclaimer I have to sort of bring up right away, is that I'm not a professional animator. Obviously, if you've seen any of my work, that should be clear. It's not what I do as a job. It's just something that I do for fun, and that's kind of the point here, is that if you're someone who just wants to try it out, who thinks, you would enjoy animation in some way, thinks you would get something fulfilling out of it, just want to do it as a hobby, or just want to explore it, period, this is for you. This is all about you. This is why I'm doing this. And you can totally go from being an amateur animator person to becoming a professional later on. That's absolutely a thing, but I can't tell you how to do that. I can't tell you how to cover that part of the journey. I can't tell you the details of how to create professional looking animation. Thankfully, there are tons of other resources online or in actual educational institutions to handle that side of things. I'm not qualified to talk about this stuff. I'm just qualified to talk about this from the perspective of someone who had nothing to do with animation at all, and then years later, it's something I do on a pretty regular basis and something that I really, really enjoy. And if there are other people kind of on the edge and they need something to tip them over to actually get started, that's what I want to try and provide here. Let's go ahead and get started. I would like to tell you a story. This is the story of how I got started with animation, and this was about, let's say 7-8 years ago. I was definitely one of those people who enjoyed drawing and coloring and things like that, visual art related stuff when I was a kid. Like plenty of kids, it was just part of the school experience. It was just something you did on your free time. And then when I got a little bit older, I would say around, 4th or 5th grade, I started to realize, there are a lot of other people around me. There are a lot of other kids who are much better at this stuff. And that made me feel like, what's the point? This means that I'm not good at this, so I'm going to stop doing it. And even years later, in the high school years, when I was starting to think about college, I just kind of considered any temptation I had to get back into art, sketching, painting, whatever. I just felt like it would kind of be a waste of time because it had absolutely nothing to do with my desired career path whatsoever. It just seemed like, I should really, focus my attention on the stuff that might help me get a job. Joke's on me, because I still don't really have a career. But that was definitely my mindset. In the handful of time that I tried to just do something like that for fun with visual arts, I would just get immediately frustrated because I looked at the work and within a few minutes I was just like, this is junk. Like, this is so ugly. I can't execute these ideas that I have in my head. It's just not working. I would get very frustrated and stop, which is something I do in general. If I really encounter some friction with something or I try something new and I'm not very good at it, I'm extremely tempted to just quit. Nowadays, I've gotten a little bit better at sort of moving past that initial reaction, and I'll talk about that when we get to like motivation and insecurities and stuff a little bit further in the video. But for now, that was what kept me away from it. Either I just felt like it was a waste of time, or I just felt like I was so bad at it, especially compared to other people who clearly had skill in that area. I just didn't want to get anywhere near it. It made me feel bad about myself, so I just didn't engage. That did not change for quite a long time. In fact, it wasn't until, well, about 7 or 8 years ago, I was in college. Towards the end of my college experience, a professor friend of mine, Daniela, who's just a wonderful person and is a professional professor, obviously, and poet and writer, she turned me on to the work of Linda Berry. And if you're not familiar with Linda Berry, I mean, my gosh, I could do a whole video or series of videos on her work. I'm a huge fan. She's a visual artist and a teacher, and she's mostly in the area of like cartooning. She has this really strong aesthetic to most of her work. She does some great visual work, and she's put out a bunch of books. Most of them are highly visual. You could almost sort of consider them like comic books or graphic novels, but they tend to be nonfiction. So she's trying to communicate ideas, not from a character perspective, but just as Linda Berry. And one of her very consistent sort of themes, I guess, or just her areas of focus, is trying to figure out why certain people stop drawing or painting specifically when they're very young and they just never return to it. And from that point, she tries to find ways to really strongly encourage people, specifically those people who just dropped visual arts a long time ago, to get back into it. And there are a lot of specifics about the ways that she actually accomplishes that, but one of the things she's done in the past is she's held classes. And in terms of students she would accept for those classes, it would be a combination of people who are very adept at visual arts and then people who had not done anything with it basically since they were little kids. In particular, her book Syllabus is fantastic, and it's all about building this class and the experience of it and how she tried to encourage students to get back into it and the exercises she would have them do. Highly recommend it. You could get a copy of this book for super cheap. Anyway, reading through some of these books, and Syllabus in particular, really got me into a headspace of, okay, how about I just do it? How about I just try to do some of this stuff for fun? And I didn't go right to animation at all. I just tried to do some early sketches. Most of it was with heavy referencing to objects around the room or something. And even then, I still had that very strong sense of, I kind of hate this. It's just a constant reminder that I'm not good at this at all. But from there, maybe as kind of a pivot, I thought, well, I'm not especially good at doing all the sketching stuff, but I can do it relatively quickly. What if I try to do some animation? I knew nothing about animation at all, other than the basics of like, the image changes a little bit from frame to frame. And that creates the illusion of movement. That's all I had, and I didn't know what materials would really be used. I didn't even know about any of the animation software programs out there outside of Flash, which has since been renamed to Animate. I knew absolutely nothing about it, but I figured I'd try. I had some free time on my hands. I had also recently gotten into the work of Don Hertzfeldt. I've talked about his stuff so many times before, and I really think it was the minimalism of Hertzfeldt's work that really appealed to me and sort of motivated me, because I thought, well, I mean, ultimately, these are mostly just stick figures. There are almost never any backgrounds. There's very little color, if there's color at all, which was a whole other thing. I definitely felt more confident in just sketching something in a single color as opposed to trying to apply color stuff. And even today, I'm still trying to wrap my head around color theory and palettes and all that stuff. I still have a hard time with it. But anyway, I was thinking, I can draw stick figures. I can just do images on a plain background. That's not such a big deal. So what I did was I went down to the Blick. It was in, I think it's the Blick in Cambridge. I forget the exact location. I grabbed a roll of like 10-pound paper, 10 or 12-pound paper. So it's very thin. You can see through it. And I thought that was just like so key to the animation process, was being able to see, you know, previous frames, previous cells, stuff like that, and compare and add little changes. So I started doing some animation work, knowing none of the principles of animation. I was working with exclusively with Pilot G2 pens, which was a bad idea. In fact, I even remember telling a friend of mine, we were at some bar in Harvard Square, and I was like, oh yeah, I'm really excited. I'm doing some animation stuff, and I'm using these G2s. And she just said, that's stupid. That's a really stupid idea. I would draw on these sheets and trying to change images, almost random images, just scenes that I could have develop over time. I'll show some of that footage here. It's a little rough, and as you can tell, in terms of capturing this stuff, I didn't have any kind of scanner. I didn't even think about putting these on a flatbed scanner. Also, they were all cut to different sizes since I had cut them manually. So trying to line them up, I was literally just taking photos of each one with my iPhone and just trying my best, basically, to get it lined up. And I thought I was doing such a great job. And then eventually, in fact, I finished doing that animation work after I moved to Los Angeles a few months later. And it was a real hassle to stitch everything together. I was stitching all these photos together in Blender, which is kind of a headache. But I thought it was, at the very least, kind of neat that I had finished something, period. And all the animation stuff you're seeing here, all these sequences, were used for like an interview series thing that I did. That was one of the first things I ever posted to YouTube, and you won't find it. I got rid of it, but I do still have the animations. I do think some of them are kind of neat, and they definitely have some strong ties to some of the animation stuff I'm doing now. But long story short, that was the first real bit of animation I ever did, and it felt pretty good just to finish something at all. It was just a nice experience, and despite the fact that, no, this doesn't look all that great, and in particular, it really bothers me now the way in which everything jumps around because I couldn't photograph them consistently. It was motivational, and that's one of the big reasons why I try to encourage people just to get started, is because once you have something to show for your effort, even if from a somewhat objective perspective it's like kind of bad, which doesn't really matter anyway, it's okay. You did something. You can look at it and say, okay, I finished it. I can move on to the next thing. I've learned some lessons. And from there, yeah, I mean, I kept using that same method for a long time with the 10-pound paper, pens, whatever I could find. I'm not especially happy with any of that work from around that time, but at the very least, it got the gears moving. There's a difference between having an idea of what a particular activity or hobby is actually going to be like and what you could do with it, as opposed to actually doing some of it. All of a sudden, these new opportunities sort of grow out of it. You think, oh, wait, now I see another chance here to do something interesting. I have a new idea for something I could change, a parameter I could tweak. That's really exciting. And that's another huge bonus of just doing it. Even if you have not the slightest education in how to do it right, quote unquote, you gain so much and you explore so much of your own ideas. You start to understand your own individual artistic voice that'll develop over time. And one of the best things of all is that if you just keep up with the work for, let's say, I don't know, a year, even just a couple months, you can line all that stuff up and say, look, here are the ways in which it's changed. I like this change. I don't like this change. Here's something from the older work that I want to sort of recapture. It's fascinating to just have it all in one place and be able to get a sense of how you've developed as an artist. It's wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful. I also have really moved on to animation software and digital formats, which is a million times better in terms of just convenience and executing certain visions and making mistakes and being able to correct them or change them very, very easily. I'll be talking about, the tools and stuff and your different options in just a little bit. But before that, I do want to get into just a very important part of the process to me, which is being aware of your anxieties and insecurities about trying to do some creative work and how to move past them. This applies, I think, to most of the work I do, especially here on YouTube. I'm never trying to tell other people how they feel or how to feel. I am not assuming that my experiences line up with, a bunch of other people's experiences. I'm just sharing my thoughts and experiences in the hopes that other people will find some of them relatable, that they'll line up with how other people feel about a certain thing. That's definitely what I want to do here, is just talk about some of the thoughts that go through my brain when I sit down to get started on something, or even worse, long before I sit down to get started on something, and that can potentially prevent you from even trying in the first place, which in my opinion is one of the worst things and really really gets in the way of any kind of personal progress. Okay, so I'm a very anxious person. It's something that I just deal with. I think I've gotten a little bit better in terms of overcoming some of those or just letting go of some of those anxieties when they're not relevant to what I'm doing in the moment. But most of the time, the biggest worry that goes through my head is just that no one cares. No one cares what you have to say. No one cares about what you're making, or it's just going to be so bad that if you dare to, try to share it with other people, you'll just be yelled at. I'm not crazy about being yelled at. Especially for something purely creative. And again, even going back to those early days of me trying to get back into drawing, if I didn't see the results I wanted very quickly, I still sometimes just get upset about it. I'm just I don't know, I just can't connect the dots, I can't execute the ideas that I have. And again, this is definitely an area where I think just doing the thing is such a big help. And in general, we know this now, talent is kind of bullshit. Yeah, some people might have a sort of natural ability that lends itself to a specific activity or profession or whatever, but the vast majority of how good you are at something just depends on the amount of time you've put in. If you put in more time, even without instruction, you will get better at what you're trying to do. And I'm not saying that it's not important to learn techniques, and I will be talking about some techniques, in fact, in a bit, but I don't think the perspective of, I'm bad and I'm always going to be bad because I don't have a certain talent is helpful at all. I also don't think it's true in most cases. It really just comes down to how much practice have you had? How much time have you put in? How much are you focusing on learning from mistakes or things that you want to change? And in terms of sharing it and worrying that other people aren't going to like the thing, well, first of all, you don't have to share any of it. And this is something Linda Berry talks about quite a bit. It's just how about this? Challenge yourself to do a bit of work and put it away. Don't even look at it yourself for 2-3 weeks. Then come back to it, see how you feel about it. Or come at it from the perspective of, I'm not doing this for other people at all. I'm just doing this for myself. And as someone who does creative work on a professional level in other areas that are not the visual arts, I know it sounds cliche, but even if this sounds corny, it was something it's just been very important for me to come to grips with it over time. And basically comparing your work to other people's work and just ingesting a lot of work from other people can be really positive and constructive, and it can also be sort of harmful and negative in other situations or just in other ways, especially for certain personality types, I feel. So on the positive side, exposing yourself to a lot of other work and other ideas and other styles that other people have come up with can be really exciting. It can be inspiring. It can add to sort of the subconscious soup of experiences that you can then draw on later to create your own work. But on the negative side of things, it can also really be a discouraging factor, I think, too. At least for me, just sometimes being confronted with really fantastic work from someone who really knows their stuff, who's taken a ton of time to develop their own voice and who has executed that voice very well, can make me feel what am I doing? Is my stuff any good? Does it have this kind of value? What if that person's younger than me and I feel like I'm lagging behind? It can really split off in both directions. And I think especially when you're starting out, it can be tough to walk that line. It can be tough to see a lot of other work from people who have much more experience in animation or just visual arts in general, and feel intimidated because you're not seeing the steps they took along the way to get where they are. And meanwhile, you're just trying to take the first couple of steps without falling over. And personally, this is just a subjective view of mine on artistic voice and artistic merit and all that. It's just that the more time you spend with your work specifically and trying to communicate just feelings or ideas of your very own through your own unique voice, it's only ever a benefit, because that's the work from myself or from others that actually does something for me. It's the work where someone's not just mimicking what other people have done. It's not just someone doing something very commercial and accessible and easy. No, you can tell when someone's doing some difficult work with themselves, trying to create something really special. And sure, education, techniques, structure, those can all help you reach that goal. But at least personally, I think I've made more progress on that front just from experimenting, just from trying things out, responding to it, letting it sit over time, comparing work, as I talked about earlier. Really, I just want to communicate that doing the work at all is so wonderful for feeling a sense of progress. You're just learning about yourself. You're learning about what you want to accomplish. You're learning how your attitude is changing over time, how the work is changing over time. And it gets really exciting, especially once you have some momentum going. If you're someone who thrives from doing something every single day for a little bit of time, go ahead and do that. If you just want to do it, every week or every month, or just when you're really feeling the urge, okay. But generally speaking, I think the more time you put in and the more time you dedicate to exploring what you want to create, I feel like that yields better results. If that sounds like it'll help you out, go for it. Okay, now that the savvy stuff is out of the way, let's talk shop. So first things first, let's talk about some of the tools, gear, etc. that you can use to actually do some animation. We'll start out with physical, like real world tools, and then we'll move on to computers, digital tech, all that fun stuff. So obviously, for decades and decades, professional animators were using physical paper, they were using translucent slides, things like this, to create professional animation for television and film. We don't have to do that anymore, obviously, but in terms of trying to get started like this very minute, there's a good chance you have some kind of paper and writing utensil within reach right this very moment. It could be regular computer paper, it could be Post-its and things, a notebook, even just using the corner of like a stack of Post-its or a notebook is actually kind of a decent way to just test out the very basics of animation and get a sense of motion, and you can see the results pretty darn quickly. So I'm definitely not knocking that option, but otherwise, if you want to do something on a larger scale, that's a little less annoying to work with in terms of drawing on the darn thing. Yeah, just sheets of paper, I would say, as long as they are uniformly sized sheets of paper, because, as I already touched on, the most difficult part, a lot of times, of capturing physical drawings and turning them into animation, it's really difficult to get everything 100% lined up so that you're shooting it from the exact same angle every time, has the same borders, and honestly, it's just not very practical. You can do it, you can just make some drawings on some pieces of paper, take photos of each one of those with just your phone, and then slap them together in an editing program or another software deal on your computer. It's probably going to look very jerky because each drawing won't be lined up with the one before and after it. That's an issue for animation, certainly. But again, if you're just trying it out, that's okay. You're just kind of getting your feet wet. However, another huge drawback of using physical materials here, especially as a beginner, is that it's actually very difficult to get a sense of what it looks like when you put everything together. Again, that you just like Post-its or a notebook or something, that's probably your best option because flipping them gives you some kind of sense of speed, combines the images together. You can't really do that with like computer paper or something like that. It just doesn't quite work out. You just have to kind of manually flip through them and see in your mind's eye how it will look at different frame rates and everything. And if you're brand new to animation, that's probably not going to be easy at all. So yes, you can do the physical stuff. It's relatively cheap. Paper, pencil, pen, that's really all you need. Something to take a photo of it with. And then you can combine them again in an editing program on the computer. Or I used to use Blender to stitch them all together into a video file. There are different ways to do that, but it's generally a big headache and it probably won't look that spectacular, and it might actually make it more difficult to learn that way. At least that's my personal take on it. So now I want to move on to some of the digital options, and thankfully there are just a ton of them at a bunch of different price points as well. So even if you're on a pretty tight budget, we got options for you here for sure. So the very first thing is programs or apps specifically that you can get on your phone or your tablet. That could be stuff like Flip-a-Clip is one that's fairly popular. There is a free version. I think there are in-app purchases and ads and stuff. So if you're willing to deal with all that, that's okay. I've never been all that thrilled about like the selection of brushes or features in Flip-a-Clip. It's okay. It's pretty basic, but again, that's what we're talking about. So go ahead, you can start downloading that right this minute for no charge. That's a pretty decent option. Procreate, which you you can get on phones, iPads, etc., is an all-time favorite of mine. That's what I've been using in the animation streams. In fact, let's put a pin in Procreate right now, because I think I need to talk about some of the other options first so that I can better illustrate why Procreate is such a good option for me, and I think for plenty of other people getting started with animation. So in terms of actual computer programs, like on your laptop or your desktop computer, Mac or PC, you do have a decent number of options between professional and open source animation programs. In terms of open source stuff, one of the ones that I'm most familiar with is called Krita. Completely open source, completely free. However, it's mostly a digital drawing program, and the 2D animation features are decent, but nothing all that robust. And as is the case with plenty of open source software, in my experience, the user experience is difficult and confusing, and it's kind of hard to learn. Yes, there are tons of tutorials out there on Krita and the next program we're going to talk about, but it's personally not a favorite of mine. Also, when you're doing animation on a computer, you need an input method that's reliable. Drawing with a mouse is insane. I mean, you can try it if you want. So what you can do instead is you get a USB drawing tablet. Wacom makes these. What's the other? Monoprice makes some pretty decent ones at good prices too, generally cheaper than the Wacom ones. You don't even need to get a very big one. Obviously, you don't have a display in the tablet. It's just an input method, kind of like a touchpad. You have your little stylus, and that will work with basically any of the programs I'm going to talk about here. Works with Krita just fine. It works with even Photoshop. Works with Blender, which is another open source option. Blender is most well known for being an open source program for 3D modeling and CG animation stuff. It's great for that. I can't handle that. I can't wrap my brain around it. Again, like Krita, it's pretty hard to learn in terms of programs. It's just very dense, very robust in terms of features, which is ultimately a good thing, but getting into it all and sifting through the tutorials to understand stuff and really putting the time in, that's another huge step. And if you're really just excited to try some animation like very soon, that might get in the way. It is worth it ultimately. I know some people who watch this channel are big into Blender and have done some great things with it. That's not me so far. It is an option. It does have a 2D animation option, 2D animation mode that I've heard pretty good things about, a decent number of brushes, stuff like that. What else? On the professional side, quote unquote, in other words, paid animation programs, one of the most obvious and well-known choices is Adobe Animate, which was previously known as Adobe Flash. And first of all, in terms of paying for it, well, we all know that Adobe switched to this subscription model, so you're going to have to pay a monthly fee if you're brand new to the Adobe stuff, or if you're a student, you can get an introductory rate of about $30 US per month. That'll go up over time, of course. If you just want that one program, I think it's less. It's maybe around $24 a month. So it's a decent chunk of change, especially if you're on a pretty lean budget. And as for the program itself, it works with the USB tablets, as I mentioned earlier, but it's all vector-based. And I'm sure plenty of you guys know what that is. Vector-based versus bitmap-based. It can be scaled to different sizes, the work you do in there, without losing resolution, but that also means that the brushes are extremely simple. In fact, it's basically just one brush that, in my opinion, looks very digital right from the get-go, especially once you get the smoothing turned on for that brush. It's pretty simple, so if you think you're going to be doing like some really detailed work or do something that looks like physical paint and all these things or charcoal and pencil and stuff, it's not going to happen in Animate. And even I think a lot of the pros just tend to use Animate for like animatics, roughs, just get an idea of movement, character stuff before going into another program to do final work, the cleanup work and all that. So I'm not huge on Animate. If you already have the Adobe subscription, it's worth checking out just because why not? It's not a huge program to download anyway. So go ahead and try it. Outside of that, obviously there are just tons, maybe dozens and dozens of professional programs for 2D animation that you can get for computer that are much more expensive. Plenty of other professional software that gets very expensive. However, in my opinion, one of the biggest drawbacks to using any of this stuff, even though, yes, it can be very powerful, yes, it can be a great way to learn the basics of animation and to have great features for animating to sound and animating on multiple layers, all of that is great, but at least for me, animating with a USB tablet where I can't see what I'm drawing on the surface where I'm drawing it, there's a disconnect of seeing it appear on the screen. I've never quite gotten used to that. I still feel very clumsy clumsy when I'm using a USB tablet, you can get one of those very fancy touch pen displays. It's basically a monitor, with a touch display. You can use a stylus. They'll use those in professional animation studios, video game studios and stuff, but those are very expensive, like at least $1,000, I think, in that ballpark. So, again, for a beginner, probably not great. And this is where I'm going to come back around to the apps and specifically to Procreate. Okay, so Procreate's around $10 to begin with. So already we're doing all right. We're doing a good job. Even if you just want to mess around with this stuff for fun, have no idea whether you're going to be into it or not. $10 is not a lot to lose, I think. It should be okay for most people, especially if you have any kind of iPad or other tablet that can run the latest software versions for its respective system. Just do it. Just do it right now. And again, okay, so sure, some people might say, okay, Procreate is not primarily an animation app, and that's completely true. It is mostly a digital art app, but it has just a handful of key animation features in here. You can do 2D animation. You can technically work with layers, even though it's sort of complicated to set up. And most importantly for me, you get so many fantastic brushes, really wonderful brushes, anything from like oil, acrylic brushes, different ink brushes, charcoal, pencils, insane abstract brushes, pattern brushes. There's so much to mess around with, and that is immediately a huge bonus for me because that's what I've always wanted from an animation program. In fact, I even tried to use Photoshop for animation in the past, which is not recommended, just because it had all these wonderful brushes that I couldn't use in Animate, so I never had the best of both worlds. And Procreate definitely has drawbacks. For one thing, using it on a phone rather than a tablet of some kind is not good. It's not a good experience. You do technically probably have to get a stylus to use with your tablet, although I just use the Adonit Mark, which is like literally $10-15. Really not a big deal. And yeah, I really wish you could animate to sound. If there's a way to do that, I'm not aware of it. And sometimes I just don't have the storage space for these relatively large animation files that I'm creating. But other than that, it is fantastic. And especially compared to Animate, exporting an animation with a transparent background so that you can put it on top of something else is a million times easier than trying to do with Animate. It is shockingly difficult to do that with Animate, or at least it was in the recent past. Absolutely hated it. And here it's super easy. That's how I turn out stuff for videos. I'll just have a few frames of animation, export as GIF basically with a transparent background. You can either airdrop it to one of your devices, you can email it to yourself. Very, very easy to swap files around, get them where you need them to go. And personally, being able to see that immediate translation of, oh, I'm drawing on the surface and I see the mark where my stylus is incredibly helpful to someone like me who's not a professional and I have difficulty drawing on model to begin with. I love it, honestly. Again, just for the price alone, it's at least worth trying out to see if you're into it. I think I would honestly have a difficult time going back to using a USB tablet with a computer animation program. I don't think I would enjoy that very much at all, and I think it would feel very limited as compared to what I can accomplish with Procreate. Highly recommend. I think that does it in terms of tools. We're good for the moment on that, at least for the absolute basics. So now, finally, at long last, let's do some lessons, or just like even less than that. I just want to explain a handful of the concepts that are very important to understand in terms of getting started with animation. So, actually, I think they're generally considered to be about 12 core principles of animation, and they tend to be traced back to this book from a couple of Disney animators released in the 80s. And there's a whole bunch of them. Check out the Wikipedia article if you want like a quick rundown. Also, plenty of people have made videos about these principles of animation, and in fact, if my explanations don't feel especially handy to you, I'll try to put links to other videos that talk about these same concepts so you can get a different perspective on things. I'm going to try to explain why these ideas are so important to animation and why they immediately make your work look better. Obviously, we just have here, if you're using any kind of animation program or app, we have the timeline. And technically, the timeline eventually exists with physical pen and paper animation too. It's just that, as I mentioned earlier, you don't get to see the results when you're doing it with physical materials, as opposed to right here in one of these digital programs. Timeline's right there, very easy to understand. Each of these will have a different image, and as they move at a certain speed, they will create the illusion of movement. There you go, not too bad. We also have something called onion skin in basically every animation program ever, and this just refers to giving you a low opacity view of one or more previous and future frames so that you can compare the work you're doing on the current frame to those around it. Easy to understand. And here in Procreate, which I use all the time, you can change the opacity of the onion skins, you can change the range of the onion skin in case you really want to just focus on a handful of frames. Once you get into this stuff, you will understand why that's very useful. Okay, next we have frame rate. So, I mean, I think most of us understand frame rate already to some degree, whether it's in terms of like filmmaking stuff, video game stuff. It's how many discrete frames are being displayed in any given second. And here in animation, as soon as people bring up this topic, they jump to the like industry lingo that I don't think is very helpful for a beginner animator. So you have like on 2s, on 4s, and it's industry jargon to communicate frame rate. I find it much more helpful and straightforward to just say the frame rate with the number. So 10 frames per second, 10 FPS has 10 discrete frames every second. 12 frames every second. 15, etc., 4 frames a second. You get the idea. And if I show you here on one of my little practice animations, I'll just change the frame rate. Very easy to do here in Procreate. You can see immediately really changes how everything looks. Obviously, it's speeding up the footage or slowing down the footage, but it also is very important for giving your piece of animation a very particular feel. And this is yet another reason why I highly recommend using a software program for animation as opposed to physical materials, especially for longer projects, because in these programs you can change this very quickly and compare immediately and see the differences and see what you prefer, what works better for your specific project, as opposed to making different video files at different frame rates. It just really slows things down. It's not a good option, I think. That's frame rate. Honestly, just see what works for you. See what works for the project you're currently working on. And this goes without saying, but the higher the frame rate, the more individual frames you will have to draw or loop to hit a certain runtime. Okay, so if you want something to play, if you're making a piece of animation at 10 FPS, 10 frames per second, and you want it to last for, let's say, just 10 seconds, not long at all, that's 100 images you have to whip up. And that's another thing that I think most of us already know about animation, and that you just kind of have to accept about it if you want to get involved, is just, it takes time. It's a very time-consuming activity, and especially when you're trying to get things just right, it takes a good while. But hey, how about this? How about if you make the document 5 frames per second and you still feel like the movement is being communicated in a fun and interesting way? Great! Now you can hit decent runtimes without having to have nearly as many individual images. And again, you can change these parameters at any time depending on how you're feeling and what you're trying to accomplish. We're really firing through these. We're getting through them now. Okay, next up, we have the concept of keyframing. Now, in the language of those fellows who kind of coined the terms for all these principles of animation, they talk about keyframing using the term pose to pose, and it's a different approach from what they call straight ahead animation. So the idea here is that straight ahead animation, you are drawing one frame at a time, and you're drawing completely in sequence with no gaps. So however you want the next image to appear, you draw it and maybe don't exactly know how the timing is going to work out by the end of it. Pose to pose, keyframing, you're essentially giving yourself little, how should we put this, little buoys. You see, little markers at certain moments in time throughout your piece of animation. If you know, okay, I want a ball to get flung up in the air, and after 3 full seconds, I want it to have dropped down again and bounced up again a little bit. Drawing the ball at certain key positions throughout your timeline here, based on how long it'll take to get to those frames, makes it a lot easier to sort out your timing in between these keyframes. It gives you an idea of where you're headed, and that way you can be sort of smarter about how you get there. Does that make sense? That's not a bad way to put it, I think. And I really think that I'll just have to whip up an example here because it's much easier to illustrate visually. So instead, if I decided, oh, I want to just do this bouncing ball straight ahead, I'm kind of guessing the whole time. Each subsequent frame, I'm guessing like, oh, I guess it should be here by now. And then by the end of it, I'll just see at what frame it hit the ground, at what frame it bounced back up. It's not as precise. It does work for different approaches. I do use straight ahead animation quite a bit because I'm not always trying to have some kind of crazy motion. I'm not trying to hit certain actions within certain amounts of time. It can feel more organic that way, so it is kind of a preference thing. But if you're trying to be more precise, if you have an idea of, oh, something has to hit within a certain runtime, it just makes perfect sense to use keyframes. It just gives you an idea of where you're going. Especially if you're animating to sound. Keyframing is basically essential. Let's say you're trying to lip sync a mouth motion to certain words. You need to find where a different sound or word starts, and that's where you're going to change the mouth to a certain shape. It's just very useful. Again, I think it's something that's easier to see in action, but it's certainly something to keep in mind, especially as you get more involved into like moving characters around or having environments change or just kind of having any specific movement in general. Super useful. Now, another concept that ties in very closely with keyframing, and I think this is even kind of just like a whole umbrella of topics, is just timing. It's timing and how you space out movements to give those movements a certain sense of motion or speed or exaggeration or a natural feel, whatever. As we know in cartooning in general and in plenty of animation, the goal is rarely to be completely precise and realistic. Instead, we want things to be very exaggerated. We still understand and identify with plenty of the motions because they're based on reality, but they're much more taken to the extreme. Let's say everything's heightened and weird and a little bit crazy in tons and tons of animation, and timing is a huge part of that. So again, and forgive me, but this is a very common example people use when explaining the principles of animation. The bouncing ball, it's a classic. If we want to have the ball fall to the ground, as a beginner, and I did this myself all the time when I was starting out with animation, I just kind of naturally drew the ball falling at a steady rate, and I had like about an equal amount of space between the ball's position from one frame to the next. It just seemed like what I should do. It seemed exact and precise, but the effect is that it doesn't have much life to it. I guess that's kind of an abstract way to put it, but that's not how things move. We have to consider things like acceleration and deceleration. We have to consider gravity and weight. How you communicate speed and interesting timing through your animation is by varying the distance of your subject between different frames. So obviously, if we want to have the ball fall faster, the space between the position of the ball in each frame gets larger. It's increasing, it's getting faster, and if you really want to exaggerate it and make it look like it's falling very fast, then it may only take, 2 or 3 frames to hit the ground rather than 5 or 6. Completely different feel, and again, something that you can mess around with at will. Highly recommend the ball example just because it's easy enough to draw quickly, just to sort of experiment and internalize these ideas rather than just hearing someone talk about them. It's very helpful, and that applies to so many things. It's something that can be more easily accomplished through the use of keyframes, and yeah, it makes things more exciting in general than just trying to see something move at a very steady pace. In terms of hand-drawn stuff and putting some kind of human feel into it, some kind of soul into your subject, it can be great to vary the speed of movement, whether it's slowing something down, speeding something up, etc. And another way we exaggerate movement and make things feel a little bit more alive is through the very famous principle of squash and stretch, which is the last one I'll be talking about here. You already watch animation YouTube stuff. You've definitely heard people talk about squash and stretch before, and best of all, the term is incredibly self-explanatory. Subjects squash and they stretch out. In other words, things look more malleable than they might be in real life. Why not use the ball example once again? If we want it to look more dramatic, a little bit more interesting and fun, we don't just have the ball look like the exact same circle in every single frame. So when it impacts with something, or there's some sort of force being transferred out of the ball, from the ball into something else, the shape of the ball changes. and how dramatically we change the shape of the ball can communicate different things. If we want it to seem like really heavy and squishy, we squash it a whole bunch and stretch it out a whole bunch. If we want it to seem a little bit more mild, slightly more realistic, it only squashes a little bit and stretches out a little bit. You can do this with human subjects. You can do this with inanimate objects that happen to be moving around. It just immediately makes things more interesting. It's definitely something to try out. It might be something more difficult to pull off if you have a visually complex subject, but if you have a nice simple subject, especially just for practicing, it's not a huge deal. It's very easy to mess around with, and I think the results speak for themselves. And honestly, I think that's about it for now. I hope I did a half-decent job of explaining some of these principles. Again, I'll also link some people who talk about the basic principles of animation. They'll probably give you much better illustrations of those principles as well. But honestly, just with that much information, it's enough to get you started. And again, that's sort of the goal of all of this, is just to push you over the edge and say, yeah, why not just try it? Why not just do some of the work? See which of these rules you like, see which of them you don't, which of them sort of speak to you and which seem to get in the way of what you're trying to communicate with the animation. Just so many possibilities, so much fun to explore this stuff. And those specifics are things that no one else can tell you about. Those are things that you're just going to discover over time once you start putting real effort into this and trying new things. I think we made it. I think we made it, gang. And I hope you find ways to make some kind of animation, period. It doesn't have to be good. You don't have to show anybody at all. It can just be something that you enjoy. And on the other hand, if you want to keep practicing, you want to just keep getting better, maybe even go pro one day, that's awesome too. But at least for me, animation has just been something that has really added just a ton of value and joy to my life. And I have a hunch that there are plenty of other people out there who are like I was 7-8 years ago, when I was just like, nah, that's not for me. I just can't do it. My work's so bad. It's so ugly. It's not worth the effort. It has been worth the effort. At least for me, it really has added something. And I just wanted to share that with folks. That's all for today. Thanks for stopping by.